Alright, yo, what's going on, guys? It's your boy Zinx here, back today with another video. In today's video, we're going to be breaking down all of the CDL matches from Major 3 Week 2 qualifiers, as well as breaking down my predictions for this week's upcoming matches. Same format as last week, not going to blur you guys with the details, you guys already know how this goes, so let's get right into it. Starting with our first match on Friday, Atlanta FaZe, the Major 2 champions, were taking on the 12th-seeded London Royal Ravens. As I predicted in last week's video, our Major 2 champions were able to take a full sweep of the series. However, this series was a lot closer than most people would have anticipated. Although they did lose the series 3-0, there are a lot of positives to take away from this series. If we look at a breakdown of the maps, Atlanta FaZe were only able to take the hard point by a 20-point deficit, going into a search and destroy on El Asilo, which is arguably one of FaZe's best maps recently because nobody will play them on Embassy. London were able to take FaZe all the way to around 11 and were unfortunate not to clutch out due to a 1v3 clutch by Abizi. And London were able to take FaZe to around 5 on a Hotel Control, which is arguably one of FaZe's best control maps. In my opinion, while this may not be the result that London wanted, there were a lot of positives to take away from this, and they looked a lot better in this series than they have throughout the entire season so far. The next match on Friday featured Toronto Ultra versus Optic Texas. I predicted that Optic would go into this series and take Ultra down by a score of 3-1 or even 3-2, but that's not how this went. I don't know what it was about this series, but on the day, Optic just looked really flat, and Toronto Ultra looked like a championship quality team. If we look at a breakdown of the stats, both of the ARs for Optic were really lackluster on the day, dropping a .63 and a .73. A lot of people were giving Dashy shit for this series, saying that this was the worst series that he's played all season, but considering the fact that he's dropped at least a 1.0 throughout the entire season, he's allowed to have one bad game. The problem is, if you're having a bad game, you need your other AR to step up, and Ghosty could not do that in this series either. If both your ARs are dropping below a .75 in this series, and the other team's AR is dropping a 1.4 on you, things are not going to go well, and that's exactly what happened in this series. If we look at a breakdown of the maps, the scores weren't even close at all, aside from the S&D on El Bagra, but even then that was a choke. Toronto dominated the first hardpoint, which arguably is their best map, but even then, still beating Optic by double their score is a landslide. Going into the S&D, Optic were up 5-2 on match point. Ultra came back and swept 4 rounds to take the W. And finally, the control. At this point, Optic looked dead, and Toronto looked poised to take the 3-0. It wasn't even a contest at this point. I just kind of wanted the game to end because Optic looked so shallow. And the final match on Friday featured Boston versus LAG. I predicted that Boston would take this series by at least a score of 3-1. However, Boston won up me and won the series 3-0, completely sweeping LAG. If we look at a breakdown of the maps, it's kind of similar to Toronto versus Optic. This matchup didn't even seem close. Breach took the first hard point on Hydro by a score of 250 to 188. Going into the S&D, Boston Breach seemed to clean up their hotel. And finally, LAG's control still continues to be absolute dog on the season, and Boston Breach took it in a 3-0 on El Asilo. Now going into Saturday's matches, starting with the New York Subliners versus Toronto Ultra. Toronto continuing their success off of a 3-0 versus Optic, continue to take down another top tier team in the CDL by taking down the Subliners by a score of 3-0. As we look into the map set here, Toronto and Subliners battled it out on Hardpoint on Hotel, which is arguably both these teams' best maps, and Toronto was able to take it by a slim score of 250 to 235. Going into an S&D on Embassy, Toronto took it by a score of 6-3, with Scrappy having several clutches throughout the round. And finally, a tight control on El Asilo saw Toronto take it by a score of 3-2, 3-0ing the Subliners and making themselves 2-0 for this week's matches. The next matchup was my most anticipated matchup on the weekend, Seattle Surge versus Los Angeles Thieves, and this match did not disappoint. Seattle Surge came out dominant on map 1, taking it by a score of 250 to 139. This led everyone to believe that Seattle was going to continue off their hot streak against Minnesota and clean sweep the Thieves. However, Thieves are never a team to underestimate. Going into that S&D, which is Seattle Surge's worst game mode, LA Thieves put Surge back in their place by beating them of a score to 6-4. Going into a control on El Asilo, LA Thieves were able to take it in around 5. And finally, a tight ending on the Hydro hardpoint saw LA Thieves take the series by a score of 3-1, despite Kenny being the only one on LA Thieves to drop a positive KD. All around, this was a really tight series. It felt like every map could go either way, and it's unfortunate that Seattle weren't able to clutch out some of these rounds, but GG's to LA Thieves for taking another W in their qualifiers. Next up, my biggest upset on the weekend, Florida Mutineers versus Boston Breach. Everyone was looking forward to how Florida would do this week considering their terrible showing last weekend. It's safe to say that this week we needed to see an improvement out of a struggling Mutineers, and they did not disappoint with this series. Boston were able to start strong in the first hardpoint on Hydro by winning it of a score to 250 to 211. However, after that, everything just started to seem to go go right for the Mutineers, and even I couldn't have predicted how good this team would look. Not really surprised by the S&D on Al Bagra. That's kind of Mutineers' best map. No matter what lineup that Mutineers seem to put in, it just seems like they have this map figured out and their strategies are really good. Going into the control on Al Bagra, it seemed like Havoc and Capsule were having an absolute field day with the Boston Breach by taking the map by a score of 3-1. And finally, the worst hardpoint team in the game were finally able to clutch out a hardpoint by taking the map 4 on Hotel by a score of 250 to 185. Admittedly, Florida looked 10 times better than they did throughout their first week of qualifiers, and with time, I think this team can really develop into a team that can compete at Optics Major. The final match of Saturday saw the Vegas Legion versus Atlanta FaZe. The Major 2 champions continued their dominance to go 2-0 on the weekend by beating Legion by a score of 3-1. There was a lot of promise in this series for Legion when they came out strong taking the first hardpoint, but everything after that went the way of Atlanta FaZe. FaZe continued their S&D hot streak on Mercado by taking the map by a score of 6-2. Going on to LSEO Control, which they've seen pretty dominant on as well, took it by a score of 3-0. And I think all hope was lost when that map 4 MSC popped up for the Vegas Legion. Let's be honest, that map 4 wasn't even close. You had Celium Eagle Challenge with a pistol. That was absolute hell if you were Vegas Legion, and a series you want to forget. And finally, for Sunday's matches. Sunday was a little weird because LAG had a little trouble losing power in their facilities following a storm. So Sunday's matches started with Optic Texas versus the Minnesota Rocker. As I predicted last week, this matchup was going to go one of two ways. Either Rocker was going to come to play or they were going to get absolutely stomped on. It seemed like Optic took all the anger they had at following that Toronto Ultra result and took it out on Minnesota Rocker by clean sweeping them 3-0. I mean, even if you look at the players' KDs, this matchup wasn't even close. Not a single person on Rocker dropped above a 1.0. Every single person on Optic dropped at least a 1.16. If we look at the map set, Optic took map 1 by a score of 250 to 111. Map 2, Optic dominated Rocker by a score of 6-1 with attached dropping a donut. And finally, to the surprise of absolutely everyone, Optic clutched out a control on Al Bagra, which is arguably Rocker's best map. If I'm a Minnesota Rocker fan, at this point, I'm absolutely shitting myself. Because 0-3 after this week's qualifiers is completely unacceptable. And with your team dropping KDs like that and getting destroyed on every map, it's not looking good going into the Optic Texas Major. I'm not going to be one of those people that sit here and say that this team desperately needs a change, because at the end of the day, I know what this team is capable of. This is the same roster that made a deep run at the Boston Breach Major. However, I think something needs to be changed in order for this team to start doing well again. Going into the next matchup on Sunday, Florida Mutineers versus Seattle Surge. This was the matchup that, I mean, nobody could predict it. The worst hardpoint team in the game versus the worst search and destroy team in the game, and for some reason, this result was flipped. If we look at the map set, Florida Mutineers took the first hardpoint by a score of 250 to 188 on Hotel, which is Seattle's best map, which made no sense. Then Seattle Surge won the search and destroy on Hotel by a score of 6-2, which I guess you could say is Seattle's quote-unquote best map because they have won it twice the last 2 times they've played on it. But even then, by this point in the series, I had no idea who was going to win it. Florida were winning hardpoints, Seattle was winning search and destroys. I couldn't tell you who was going to win this series after map 2. Map 3 control on Hotel was just as close, with Seattle Surge taking it in the round 5. And finally, normality was restored when Seattle Surge took that map 4 by a dominant score of 250 to 148. Positive is a takeaway from both sides after this series, as Seattle bounced back from losing to LA Thieves. Florida continued to build off their success and look a lot better than they did in the first round of qualifiers. And finally, the last match of Sunday. This was arguably the best matchup we've had in the CDL Modern Warfare 2 season thus far. This matchup had everything from clutches to ice plays to 1v3s to 1v4s. I was on the edge of my seat watching this series. I didn't really care who was gonna win. I was just enjoying every second of Call of Duty that these two teams played. I said last week that this was going to be a dogfight at the bottom of the table, and I was not wrong. If we look at the breakdown of maps and modes, London Royal Ravens took the first map on Al Bagra by a score of 250 to 172. As I predicted last week, LAG would take the search by a score of 6-4. That map 2 was pretty crazy. There were a lot of chances for London to clutch out a couple of rounds to take the search and destroy. However, plays like Exceed's 1v4 are the reason that LAG clutched out this search. Next onto the control, London started hot by going up 2-0, but then everything seemed to fall apart from there. Following Assault's 1v3 to clutch out the round 3, LAG would go on to take the next 2 rounds to take the map by a score of 3-2. By this point, it was looking dangerous. It was pretty much do or die for London Royal Ravens. Either they won the map 4 hardpoint and sent this to a round 5, or they would continue to be the worst team in the CDL. And thankfully for every fan watching the stream, that's exactly what London London did by taking map 4 by a score of 250 to 216. And going into the map 5, this series could have realistically only ended one way. Game 5, round 11, 1v2 by Nasty, and to give London another 10 points in the CDL to get them closer to the rest of the pack. Not the way I expected the series to go, but as a fan of the CDL, this has to be one of the best series that I've ever watched. These results left the Major 3 qualifier standings looking like this. Toronto, Atlanta, and Boston all sit atop the standings at 3-1. Seattle, LA, New York, and Optic all finished this weekend at 2-1. Vegas and London finished this week at 1-2. Florida finishes at 10th at 1-3, which is a lot better than the 0-4 I predicted them to be. And at the bottom of the standings with literally no hope to get into the winners bracket of Major 3, LAG and Minnesota Rocker gotta put a win together. All right, that's all of last week's matches broken down. Now let's break down the last week of matches going into Major 3. Starting on Friday, our first matchup is between London Royal Ravens and the Seattle Surge. Both these teams are going into this matchup with a lot of momentum, and I see this being another dogfight similar to the Ravens versus LAG. While I do think the Ravens have looked better throughout this round of qualifiers, I think Seattle Surge humbles them a little bit and wins the series by a scoreline of 3-1. The next two sets of matches features 4 teams who are struggling at the bottom. All 4 of these teams could really use a win in their next match to even have the slightest possibility of getting into the winners bracket. First matchup features Las Vegas versus Minnesota. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to say the same thing that I said last week that I said about the Florida Mutineers. If Minnesota are able to put their shit together and actually win a map, then I see them taking this series by a scoreline of 3-1. But if they come to play the same way they did against Optic, they're going to get 3-0 again, and everyone's going to be calling for a roster change at this point. Final match on Fridays features LAG versus the Florida Mutineers. While both these teams did lose to London and Seattle, I think that both these teams are going to this series just as hot. And I do think that this will be a dogfight as well, but I do actually predict that Florida is going to take this series and go 2-2 on the weekend. Next up on Saturday, Minnesota Rocker against the LA Thieves. I'm going to be honest with you, this entirely depends on how Minnesota plays against the Legion. If they lose against the Legion by a dominant scoreline, I think they go into the LA Thieves series and actually get destroyed and finish the weekend 0-5, which is like the worst record we've seen this season. If there even is a little bit of improvement, I still see LA Thieves taking this series by a score of 3-1. The next matchup features LAG and Las Vegas. Another chance for the 2 teams in the bottom 4 to get another win and get closer to the winners bracket. For me, this series comes down to the Search and Destroy. We know Legion can be dominant in Search and Destroy. They just haven't showed it through this split. And we know LAG could be dominant in Hardpoint, but they've just looked better in Search. So I think this matchup entirely depends on who comes and wins that map too. In my opinion, I think LAG take this by a score of 3-1, but it could go to a 3-2. The next matchup features Toronto Ultra versus London Royal Ravens. While the Ravens have looked hot, I'm not a betting man, but I am going to say that Toronto Ultra is going to take this series by a score of 3-0. Not to take anything away from Ravens, but Toronto has just looked dominant throughout this split, and I see them finishing on 4-1 this weekend. The final matchup on Saturday features New York Subliners versus Optic Texas. Both these teams are coming off a 3-0 loss from Toronto Ultra, and both these teams are looking to get back on track for their Major 3 qualifiers. In my opinion, while Optic has looked better with Ghosty, I just think that New York has had their number throughout the season despite whatever roster it is, so I think that New York's going to take this by a score of 3-1. And finally on Sunday, Seattle Surge are going to play the New York Subliners first. A rematch of the final at Major 1 where New York Subliners won by a score of 4-1. We know that Pred, Mac, and Sib can melt, but if accuracy shows up to the series against his former team, I see Seattle putting up much more of a fight in this series. However, I'm going to pray to God, because I'm a Subliners fan, that I see Subliners take this series by a score of at least 3-1 or 3-2. The next matchup features the biggest rivalry in Call of Duty history since the beginning of Call of Duty esports, Atlanta FaZe versus Optic Texas. I know all the Optic fanboys are going to want me to pick Optic over FaZe here, but realistically, if I'm going to keep an outsider's perspective of this, I just see no way that Optic takes this series just because FaZe have looked so stupidly dominant this split. I think FaZe's search and control has just looked astronomically better than any other team in the CDL right now. I see FaZe taking this by a score of 3-0. Please don't be mad at me, Optic fans. And the final matchup features both mid-table teams, Boston Breach versus LA Thieves. The last time these two teams met, I'm pretty sure LA Thieves took the series by a score of 3-0. However, with a Boston Breach roster looking to get a bounce back from their loss to Florida, I think they put up a fight against last year's champions and at least take this to a map 4, maybe a map 5, but I do see LA Thieves winning this by a score of 3-1. Well, that's it for this week of major predictions. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Let me know who you think is going to win each series or which series is going to be your favorite on the weekend. Be sure to check out this week's matches all on Twitch on either the CDL's channel or one of the watch parties. Thank you guys so much for the support last week. Sorry for the lack of uploads this week. I've been a little busy. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.